whose footsteps I am walking and continue to learn from, that it's a real privilege to be in conversation with some of those, like Professor Hosein, who are really doing path-breaking work and intellectual and artistic leadership in the field of post-indenture life. So Andil, welcome after that long introduction. And we would be happy to hear you talk about some of your work. And perhaps we could start with just hearing about how you began. What set you onto this journey?
Thanks so much, Gab, Dr. Hussein, Hussein, Gab,
Gab,
and
Gabby, Gabrielle, all fine.
yeah. I'm really happy to be part of this. I really support this initiative of compiling this archive. And I really love that it's going to be Caribbean based because particularly in this field, as it's wonderful. There's so much work. It's also great when it's recentered back in the Caribbean space. So I'm really delighted to be part of that. So how did things begin? There are two kinds of stories, and I've decided, as we talked about, decided to focus on this framework of visual arts after indenture, which I began to introduce in 2014. But my own work as an artist precedes that by a few years. Where's the slide? Yeah. So I began doing artwork in 2009. This is the very first piece, which was called Bear or Death by Kashmir. And this was one of the first pieces I had ever exhibited or shown in a public space. And my art practice had always just felt like it emerged, like much art does. Music, visual art, theater, it emerges from the things that artists are struggling with as part of our shared human experience. So my own practice began in that space, but of course it's tied to the particular context from which we emerge. So this, while wrapped into personal traumas and joys as well, it's impossible to think through the personal and also always for me situating it in the social historical. So one beginning of this work is just my practice itself, in which this lineage of indentureship was always implicitly part of it. But it's really around 2012 when things took another step. And it really began, I think there's an actual moment where this begins, which is at the Queen's Museum in 2012. There's a show, which was then the largest show of Caribbean art. It may still be the largest show of Caribbean art that had been ever exhibited, called Caribbean Art at the Crossroads of the World. This is the catalog cover. And I was assigned a review of it by Art in America. And, very excited to go see what was a wonderful collection of artwork. But it was quite striking to me, the very loud absence of representation of Indo-Caribbean people, particularly since this museum, the main site of the show, the Queen's Museum, is really surrounded by a very large Indo-Caribbean community. And in this show of hundreds of works, the only representation was, this is not the image from it because where I'm located, I don't have a copy of the catalog, but there was a very small photograph among these hundreds of works that said Hindu Koli woman by an anonymous French photographer. And that was the sum total of representation of the experience of Indo-Caribbean people and of the story of indentureship that was represented. So, I noted that in the review, but then I became really curious as I was doing my own work, in which it was really impossible to divorce myself from this story. It is it forms me, it forms the Caribbean. It feels simply untrue to leave it out. It's not even a question of fair representation, but honest truth telling. So for me, I really then set about to investigate it. I forgot I had a slide here of, what this is just the exact excerpt from the review. And, this kind of contrast between going to that show and seeing almost no Indo-Caribbean people, and then immediately after checking out this celebration in the community, which of course had a huge number of people there, and was vivacious. And, so it set me off, not just in my own practice, but also trying to see, well, what else was there? And I started to kind of from a very, I think, positive and maybe somewhat naive space of thinking like, well, maybe there just aren't a lot. I mean, I knew of some. And so I set about collecting this information over a number of years while doing my practice. So I've included here, so this back and forth since 2012 to now, but especially from 2014 when I introduced this framework of visual art after indenture, in which to think about the contemporary art that's been produced as a legacy of indentureship. These two pieces of me were always in play. So what you see on your screens here are examples of some of my own projects. Kuli Colors on the left, which was one of the first pieces I did. In the middle, this was a lot of the work, I have to say, also came out of these engagements with the Caribbean community in Queens. So this project, Cane Portraiture, this was an invitation to do a piece at the Indo-Caribbean Gala in 2013, in which I photographed. I set up a photo studio mimicking the experience of our photo studios in the Caribbean, where people pose in front of a backdrop. I can talk about this piece at length, but maybe not today. But just to give you an example of some of the projects, this piece had a number of personal layers to it, but also was situating our stories and ourselves and putting ourselves in the picture. And on the right, alongside this is, for me, part of the challenge and the goal is to really represent the fullness of our human condition. It is not to tell a particular story of indentureship, but to make our stories part of the Caribbean story, which they are, but also part of the telling and investigation of our human condition. So the piece on the right is a piece that was called, oh God, I think it's, 1200 matches, no flame. Yeah, which anyone who's been on online dating will know, can guess what that means. And then there were these other pieces, very important to me, were Our Holy Waters and Mine, which you see at the top. And this was another piece in which it was really about constantly working with the historical and the personal. So in this piece, there are 12 jars of water as part of the performance. 6 are inscribed with the waterways that were passed between India and the Caribbean by ships carrying indentured workers. And the other 6 were inscribed with the waterways that I live next to. And so it is simultaneously wanting to tell this story, but also not confine us to a static notion of culture in this storytelling. The middle piece, probably the most, the simplest, but also probably most popular thing, is my rum and roti bag. And then the bottom, cutlass. And then the ones at the right, again, more, not as clearly linked to indentureship, but I mean, I think part of my practice is to be constantly working with telling the fullness of the experience. And this is the last slide, which I'll share just a few of those. What is the kind of work that I was doing as an artist? And on the left, really, this is an image from a really wonderful project that's done in Queens, that's led by 2 really lovely people. Project Pretty. I'm really sorry, I'm screwing that up. I got up with a bit of a headache this morning and my mind is a little bit off. But this really wonderful project, it's a few years now, where they do beach cleanups over at a site where a lot of puja materials are left. And on one of these visits, in working with them, I did this photography project, which was then shown at a couple of places in New York. And in the middle is my first project, collaborative work with Kelly Sinapa Marie, which was an art book. And on the right The far right is the image done with Wendy Nanan, which is an addition to her series of baby Krishnas that we worked on. Which was the idea, okay, what happens in that one what happens when baby Krishna then leaves the Caribbean to go to France? That was sort of the framing work. But I wanted to put this slide up because this desire to also pursue collaborative work was essential to why I took this turn from really being trained as a social scientist and working in policy and politics toward art. And part of it was the enlivening experience of working with other artists and community members. So, these three images for me represented that kind of collaborative spirit. So as an artist, this is sort of the early work that you can see, obviously, the traces of indentureship and of the kind of ways in which Caribbean culture was formed through this experience and then transferred into the sort of second sites that Caribbean people moved to in North America and Europe.
Andil, thanks for this. And I really appreciate that you took the time to walk us through. One of my goals in this series is that for those people who are not necessarily familiar with thinking about art or seeing art or understanding art production, like myself, for example, that hearing artists talk about the work that they're producing really gives you some insights into how to understand what you're seeing and what's happening. And so for students, for everyone, I think that's really useful and generous to do. I've a number of things you said that I just want to touch on before you move forward, which is that what in drawing on indenture and its legacies, for example, it's important to it's important that what you're doing is contemporary work. You're not trying to, it's not nostalgic. You're not trying to harken back to something or be quote unquote authentic to something, that in fact, our notions of what are authentic are coming from, for example, historical records, which have their own biases and absences. And also many artists have been using things like photographic archives, and the portrait form and the early, ethnographic colonial photography was itself highly colonial. It was another act of colonization, of capturing, of framing, and of representing through a colonial gaze. And so it's almost like the thing that is most quote unquote authentic are our personal memories and our personal, relationships and our childhoods and the stories that we hear from our family members and all of that. And so I think that that's a really, the way that you centered the personal is, I think, really important for reminding that we don't want to reproduce archetypes and stereotypes and engage with the ways that we have been produced, but rather start with what's original, which is the stories that have not been told and the stories that we can personally tell as well. And then the other thing that I thought was really great about what you said is that is the question of the fullness of the human condition. And the work that artists who are reflecting on indenture, writers, artists, scholars, everyone who is kind of thinking about the Caribbean as post-indenture, that it's not just about Indians and it's not just about indenture, it's about the multitudinous histories of the Caribbean that we draw on to kind of understand ourselves and how we have navigated a desire to be human throughout history. I don't know if you just want to touch on that question, and we're not getting into it today, but your work, your current work with Nature's Wild is all about being human. And so before we move on to chatting a little bit about collaboration and curation, which I'd like to do. I don't know if you want to expand on how it is indenture for you, the legacies of it, the history of it, and so on.
Yeah,
How
this
it
is
connects
this
thinking
oh
about the human condition and
yeah.
its forms.
This is a really central question, and one that is at the heart of a lot of the development of this work over the last decade. Doing this work in 2014 is when I begin sort of scavenging through this work and like, who's doing what? What is this visual art heritage of indentureship? Who are the artists? What are they doing? And in the 2016 is the first conference on it, Visual Art After Indenture, which is held in Toronto with a number of artists and co-hosted with David Scott of Small Hacks. The time between that and now, you see this enormous development of work. It's very exciting to see how many more younger artists are seeing this as something they can do. At the same time, and I guess I should preface this by saying there is room for many, many different people taking all kinds of different positions. And oftentimes, the sort of archetypes are the ones that have the easiest access to institutions, to audiences, because we sort of are already equipped with them. So often those artists that present archetypes are embraced very quickly because they're giving what is expected. So when you talk about this heritage of whether it's the photographs, for example, the archetype of the exoticized Indian woman is very strong, both in the colonial record, but also in the new work. It's and so it doesn't mean it isn't to diminish the new work, but it's important to raise these questions. And another thing is a lot of the work, I'm giving a lecture on public sculptures of indentureship in a couple of weeks. So I've been looking back to what kinds of sculptures and monuments have people made. And it seems to me that there's a kind of demand for reverence of the past, and I can appreciate the honoring and reverence of it. But for me, it's the struggle part, it's the ability to face different kinds of challenges and move beyond that. Those are things I'd like to honor. But in terms of sort of honoring ancestry, I feel personally less invested in. I feel more in, you could see it in the way that I presented the Colin Robinson exhibition. It was about the fullness of him as a human. It was not to create a notion of a past that is pure. Because a lot of our practice, particularly I think when it comes to the history of Indian people, of South Asians, the Caribbean, there's a really strong onus to always think of ancestors as almost as near divine beings. Yeah. And, they were human, so they had flaws. And so for me, and that should not diminish their humanity in any way. So for me, in my works, and especially, I mean, if you go closely, there's always a sense of whimsy, whether it means like foregrounding the chicken or, or the piece on the left, there's a certain way in which like the centering of the Murti's derriere is at the center of the picture. Like these are whimsical acts that bring us closer to recognizing ourselves, and for audiences, not seeing us as anything more than other humans. Like that's the real challenge for me through my work. And it's something to weigh heavily because it's not something that I think is pervasive. What is pervasive are the archetypes because they have hundreds of years of history behind them. And so it is really hard to chart a path that lies outside them. And it is hard to find an audience for it. I mean, a lot of my work, I have to say, people are like, what is he doing? I mean, I'm quite comfortable. I'll tell you the first time I showed even the middle, when I did this performance at Queen's, I had questions like, but why didn't you something pretty? Why the sugar cane? And also when I did the cutlass, it was also like, why didn't you make something pretty? And then on the reverse too, if I do things that are lie outside, and those are archetypal, the cutlass has become, especially recently, quite a
Yeah.
strong symbol associated with indentureship now.
In many ways through your work.
Yeah, but when you veer beyond that, it's sort of confusing to folks. I think it's one of the reasons some of the greatest artists, like, I would put Wendy Nanan at the top of that list. Some of the ways in which they bring their personal quirks, their personal stories to it, which, the best artists always do. Sometimes they fall out of focus of institutions and audiences because we are not used to seeing things that lie outside those archetypes. Show us those photographs and we already know what to expect. So they become a kind of desirable collectible figure. But the transformational work, the work that is, lies outside, I mean, I do think those works will become more and more appreciated, but maybe not just in this moment or very quickly.
Thanks for that. Let's talk a little bit about your curatorial practices over this last decade, because I think that's been really important part of your contribution to the field. And I mean, we're looking at two of those images here as well, which is your collaborations and support to Wendy Nanan, for example, and also to Kelly Sinapa Mary.
Yeah. In 2016, this is where like the visual arts After Indenture officially begins, as a kind of, in a framework context. And this was a moment where, I could just have continued doing your own work, which I think the industry of art actually prefers that artists do, because it is a monetized capitalist industry like most of the sort of industries that exist in our contemporary world. So it places a lot of pressure on artists to produce work for the market. And that has not been something that has interested me, but I was interested in the way in which this community of artists could be built. So one way was through one-on-one collaborations. In my first show, in fact, in all of the shows, including in the next one, there are always collaborative works, because I enjoy that process. And that is primarily it. It is not even a generous act. It's because I get a lot out of being able to share this experience, and I enjoy that. And then in terms of curatorial work, it began with especially my affection and respect for Wendy Nanan's work, but also among other folks' work. So as a curator, maybe I'll come back to that. So I suppose one of the things I was left with after that conference was that, here is an artist, Wendy Nanan, who stands as one of the best artists I think the Caribbean has produced and is vastly underknown. And I think her work isn't quite taken up enough and appreciated enough. And so I wanted to do a curatorial project. Unfortunately, even though the project was up for 2 years, it opened the day that everything closed during the pandemic. So, we did have like virtual events, but of course not the same. But it is a really important moment. At the Art Museum of the Americas, this was the first time that there was going to be a solo exhibition by an Indo-Caribbean artist. It's unfortunate that it didn't, the timing of the pandemic, everyone has a story like that. But for me, in terms of thinking, I wanted to present this work both as someone invested in critical thought and thinking about our field of Caribbean studies, but also as someone who was just learning how to be as an artist. I saw Wendy as an example of the kind of way in which I wanted to work. And I came to Wendy after working a long time with Lorraine O'Grady, who is an African-American artist who was, the most formative in my practice and sort of who really set the model for working in sort of all of these multiple modes of being a critical thinker, of being a producer, of being a curator, and to embrace a kind of practice that is really not typical in the art world, because one kind of tends to choose a lane and work in that way because it's also what the market demands. With Wendy, I was just really excited to present that work. And then following Wendy, I did this for, Everything Slackens in Iraq. It was such an important project. This came about in 2022. So this was their first show after the pandemic, one of the first shows that opened in New York following this period of, shutdown. And this was a really beautiful experience. And I wonder if I'll get to have this kind of experience again, principally because this was an institution that supported your vision to no end. So it was an institution that was not expecting, there was no pressure to present the story that it wanted to tell. It was an institution that, this is the Ford Foundation Gallery, in which I could produce and imagine a show in any way that I wanted. And for me, it would, if you came into this space, you would feel how the environments of the Caribbean are placed in the space. Just from this image, and this is only like one section of the show, you see like sort of like the land and the forest, and other parts of the show, you will see the seas and the sky. Even though the environment is not explicitly a theme in any of this, it was really important for me. It was one of those things to create a kind of poetry of the space. And the four artists that were invited were also artists that sort of, they were kind of paired across time. So Wendy Nanan from Trinidad and Margaret Chen from Jamaica, both women with very long careers, 40 decades of art making. But also this was the first time they were shown in a New York space, and certainly at a gallery of this size. And then on the other hand, you had Andrea Chung and Kelly Sinapa-Marie, who are around, I believe around 40, and newer artists, but very strong professional artists. And so there's a way in which to not just reference the long story of this sort of post-indentureship afterlife, but also to put us in the present. And so this was a show that was unique in many ways. It's the only show the foundation has had where there are no labels next to the images, in which it was a show of all Caribbean women artists, but it was never a show of Caribbean women artists. Like, it was a show built around a theme and an idea. And it was just a really lovely thing to experience, because it felt like the kind of project that I would love to be able to do more of than to see more of. These were artists who were speaking, in this case, to what are humans like in a moment of crisis. For me, that was the part of the indenture story that I took to be the seed of this project. This is something that is not unique to indentures. It is not unique to any, human group. It's something that all humans face. And that kind of dynamic of, pulling from the particularities of our stories to connect with all kinds of audiences, that is part of what we were just talking about, foregrounding the human condition as the thing that the artist, the intellect investigates.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the thing about your curatorial practice as well is that you, over the years, my understanding is that you've also combined it with people who are writing about the work in a way that's really interesting. So, for example, I remember reading Shivani Ramlochan's writing about Wendy Nanan's shells, and that experience, both the kind of reflective experience of her writing about it, and then also the writing that she did do. So just, I find it's interesting that you've been also able to pull together not just your own writing as a scholar about this work, but the writing of those who are creatives in other ways as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Like publications have all, for every show, there has been a catalog.
Mhm.
For everything Slackens in Iraq, there were 3,000 catalogs, all of which were distributed, all comprising essays by Shivani Ramlochan and Richard Fang, um, and several others. There were special issues of Wasafiri. Let me just close this. Yeah, Wasafiri, it was co-edited with Nalini Mohabir, which features the artwork of Kelly, but of course, it's a literary journal that brings together some of the best voices around this work right now. And so for me, it's always I have been writing, but I've also simply enjoyed the process more in company and in conversation. So I want to see what other people think. Shivani has written, I think, the most, I always sort of Shivani's already written for the next project.
Mhm.
Um,
Giovanni uses
Shivani
words
also
that we
wrote for
have
the Colin
not
Robinson
many
project.
use. Yes, sure. Her
So,
capacity with words is just dizzying.
yes. And so, the Kuli Vien catalog had
Yeah.
Cal Turabali and Andre Bagu and Gayatri Bahadur and Joy Mahabir. And, so it was, and Lisa Uttar. And so it was really wonderful to have this kind of engagement. It is not, it would be, I wouldn't say it is purposeful community building. It is simply an activity that I've enjoyed having. And community building happens to be what results from it.
At
It's
the same
wonderful
time,
that, and it's how a field is built.
yeah,
That's what has
at the
built
same
the
time,
field over the
it
last
also
10 years.
it also speaks to it might not have been a deliberate set out of community building, but speaking as a feminist, community building is what we do implicitly. We don't necessarily set out to do it in a contrived manner, but we understand that community is where you get your sustenance, your affirmation, critique. Community is is um, is also about um, recognizing that you exist as part of a collectively experienced moment and wanting to hear and share about how that moment, that collectively experienced moment, is differently understood, differently engaged, differently felt. So I think for me, your practice is also very feminist in the sense that there has been so much generous community building as well. And just to say that we have Lisa Autar here, we have Joy Mahabir here, and we're really glad to have
Yeah,
them in
that's
the
great.
conversation. Um, and so I think this has been really important. I wanted to ask a kind, go ahead, no, you go ahead.
Yeah, I did want to mention one other part to this, which
Yeah.
is there are very different parts of my brain in operation as a curator, writer, and as an artist. And this is one of the reasons I got so drawn into art was that it was allowed, and anyone who does creative work knows this, but it is so driven by your subconscious and unconscious in a way that those of us who are primarily trained in social science don't quite appreciate and attend to as much. So for me, in sort of pursuing these at least two kinds of work, I would put curatorial with writing more than I would put it with art, for example, because it's deliberate. It is, you have a thesis you want to explore, you think through specific questions, you do kinds of research. For me, the art part just emerges. There's very little deliberative thinking, and it's usually only in the aftermath that I can come to my own artwork and think, oh, what was that? What did I do? I mean, the cover of Nature's Wild is a good example, painted by Kelly Sinapamari. But in the image, I said I wanted to hold a chicken. Did not know why I wanted to hold a chicken. Chickens are not referenced in the book. But ultimately in the aftermath, I could see why, in fact, that image so powerfully conveyed the ideas in the book and the things that I would continue to develop. So in thinking about the relationship between your work as a critic, a curator, a writer, and your work as an artist, I do feel they require very different practices in my own experience. I find that creative work that is thought through too much, or this is just every artist has their own experience. For me, almost everything that it's over planned, I really dislike, never share. I just spent months working on this project, and we did a day-long photo shoot to produce 2 photographs, but what was months in the making, required collecting a lot of materials over a lot of time. And in the end, I just didn't like it. And the one that was done on the whim is the one that will be in the exhibition. So I think it's important to recognize that as well, the kind of different parts of us that are maybe channeled in the way that we do different kinds of practices.
Thanks for that, Andil. Let's keep moving. I know you have more to say to us in your slides as well. Before we get to some of what's happening right now with your work, I wanted to ask the question we haven't really discussed, but I guess I'm wondering and I have you here so I can ask, which is, I'm particularly interested right now myself in transoceanic conversations. That is, as you know, typically Indians in the Caribbean have seen India as their kind of North Star. And to some extent, Muslims in the Caribbean have switched their North Star a little bit to the Middle East over the century. Those sources of identity and definition have shifted latitude and longitude a little bit. But I'm particularly interested in what are the conversations that we can have that are with other post-indenture sites. And and I wonder if, I mean, surely you've thought about that a little bit and engaged that a little bit. And for me, there's a very specific conversation that cartography can have that none other can have in quite the same way, and in which there's so much more still to say and share. And I wonder if you've just given that any thought before we move on to some of your upcoming work.
Yeah, absolutely. From the beginning, the project was never called Visual Arts of the Indo-Caribbean, for example. It was deliberately called Visual Arts After Indenture for a number of reasons. One, to sort of disassociate from a sense of cultural essentialism that any identity marker inevitably conveys, and to prioritize the experience itself. So the question is, what have Indian people who moved produced? But the question is, what did this system of indentureship do in changing our relationships, in marking us differently, in our rebellion toward it, in all this mess of things. So that was one part of it. But the other part of it was to draw links to other parts of the world that experienced this. So if the very first thing that came out of the project was it's online, it's afterindenture.com, and it's a list of, I think only about 50 artists are up, but there were about 80 artists identified from different parts of the diaspora, all who were touched by this particular program of indenture. So from the beginning, it was always thinking about the impact that this really important transition in history, not just to people who were indentured workers, but in the world, this transformation from exploitative and slave labor to this sort of different model that was exploitative but had limitations, this contract model. Like, this was a very important moment in the development of modern economies, and provided, among other things, a kind of new kind of ethical acceptance of exploitation in a way that was more starkly clear. before. Slavery was just wrong, period. And that is why even when we talk about indentureship, in indentureship studies, you hear competing, arguments about how bad it was, and how, which was worse, because capitalism sort of succeeded in muddying, the 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 very clear exploitative character of this new work. So that was always sort of part of it. And in this most recent kind of research in which I've been looking at public sculptures in all these places, you see the continuities. Like one thing that you see throughout is like almost every country that has had a monument to indentureship has had a statue of Gandhi or some kind of representation of Gandhi, speaking very strongly to, India as the North Star, but of course, Gandhi had a very particular role in the end of indentureship. You see the same kinds of iconography across this diaspora. You see some of the same shapes and forms of sculpture about who is honored and what the text says. And you do see the kind of centering in India, but I think that is something that wavers. Generationally, it's something that I don't, I grew up with not a very strong sense of India as the motherland in my family. It was sort of surprising to me that it was so strong in many other families. So that's one thing to say, that it's not always uniform. People have different kinds of relationships. I do think what seems to have mattered, and Ramabai Espine and I had a short conversation about this, the way in which in Canada, for example, and beyond, you could see this sort of shift where people hid their Indianness and their Caribbean identity and then claimed it. In the last 10 years, you see less shame about it and more pride about it. And it almost maps on exactly to the kind of period of India's rise as this sort of economic superpower and this sort of large cultural force. So the things that are happening are also linked to so many other phenomenon. And you see this sort of relationship to India really changing because of that, and the way in which India intervenes itself in these places. One of the things about the monuments to indentureship is the fact that it is often funded by the government of India, which is indicting to everyone, is indicting to the local space for not being invested enough to do it themselves. And I'm speaking really of governments, of not seeing that story as part of the fabric of the nation. And is also indicting of some of the kind of nationalist and Hindu nationalist impulses of the Indian government. So there are these multiple forces. But I'm really hopeful when I see some of the sort of things that people who are Gen Z now, especially, are breaking away from some of those pathways. I mean, people have done it before. People continue to do it, but I think those tensions will always sort of be there. And sometimes I feel more hopeful about carving a space that connects all of these places to the shared experience of having this point of origin that is both a period of time. This all happens in all of those places around the same time. And having similar kind of trajectories of sort of entering, spaces that had experienced slavery, that were deeply colonized and are growing together in different ways from it. So I think there's so much work to be done. But this is a central question and a complicated one to unpack. Because I think it's too easy to say that anything, even work that I would, that makes me queasy as sometimes, as being too nationalist. I feel very averse to ethno-nationalism of any kind, but I can still appreciate why people are doing it. There's this kind of, it's sort of how most societies learn their understanding of who you belong to. It begins with blood ties, and then, people see themselves as part of ethnic groups. And then also that it becomes even more powerful if you feel marginalized in a place. So you turn to a sort of to this identity as a kind of alternate site of potential freedom. I mean, you see it happening in the US. You see it across across different kinds of political beliefs in different ways. This sort of tribalism is a powerful force, but it cannot also just be dismissed. It has to be kind of taken up in a more in its situational context.
Thanks for that. It was very thoughtful. As we are moving towards wrapping up our conversation a little bit, and we do have some people in the room who I think it would be great to hear from, and let them ask you questions, let them engage in conversation with you. Tell us about the work that you've been doing more recently, and also the work that you're planning, and a little bit about what's behind that thinking.
No, I mean, I still am operating in those sort of two contexts. I'm hopeful that we will have a gathering in 2026 as a 10-year anniversary of visual art after indenture. And I'm sure there are a lot of artists I don't know. There are people on this Zoom who are, are doing a visual art practice and feel like their work belongs under this umbrella. They should send me a note because the hope is to expand the database. I mean, one of the reasons I started building the database, because when I did that review at Art in America, one of the most common things I would hear from curators was that, oh, they just don't do that. Indian people, they do folk art. It's not really, they're not doing it. And part of compiling this database was to demonstrate, well, actually, there have been these marvelous artists for decades doing work. So it's important to me that that continues. And it's important to me like the critical thinking about some of these questions continues. So I hope that as part of that 2026 project, we will also produce a volume called Visual Art After Indenture, in which we weigh some of the questions you've brought up today. So that is sort of the kind of collective critical project that I hope continues. For my own work, in 2 weeks, I'll share what you see on the screen, which is the first bronze statue I've made called Ixera Cochinilla Oshawa, which is one of 4 propositions for a public monument. And all 4 will be in my show at the Art Museum of the Americas next year in DC. And of course, keeping with the spirit of the work that I have done, half of the works, there are 16 works, half are works by me, and half are the result of collaborative works, exchanges. So, I feel in a space after all this time that it's taken that long to claim a confidence and bring in working in this kind of way. It's very unusual for this show at the Art Museum of Americas, where I am curating the experience. I'm producing half of the work are by me, half are with other people. And also we are producing what will be a really beautiful volume of essays edited by Annie Paul and featuring some terrific writers like Shivani Ramlochan and Shani Mutu, among others. So those are the things that are in the work. I think there's so much work to be done, especially around some of our past. When I think of the field, putting aside my own work, when I think about developments of the field, I really think there's so much history that needs to be unpacked and taken up. This is an image of MP Aladdin's. That's a beautiful painting in the collection of the Art Museum of the Americas in DC. But there are so many artists that we need to return to get to not just appreciate the work. Like this work is stunning, like so much of his work, just like Wendy Nanan's work is stunning, just Isaiah Budu Singh. There's so many artists who have not been taken up by art historians, by curators, and it's work that as younger artists are developing their own practice, I would also encourage them to kind of look to the past. Everyone has probably done, everyone loves to be an inventor. Like you there's this kind of practice of people constantly presenting this is new, but in fact it's such a richer experience, I think, to point to how our work emerges from this very long lineage to which some things are continuous and some things are broken. And it gives us a really richer terrain from which to produce work.
Yeah, I mean, that work from so many decades, including a lot of work that was inspired by the post-independence kind of generation of how do we reckon with the past and folk culture, but how do we think about art in a way that isn't just about folk art alone. I mean, that has not been thought about enough in terms of how a post-independence generation of artists was thinking about and living in that moment as well through this kind of art that was being produced over these decades. And I think to get back at the very beginning of our conversation, where there's an exhibit and the only thing that becomes representative is a extremely stereotyped lens of who indentured women were or who Indian women were, and that doesn't consider Indian art or art after indenture, to use our theme today, to be contemporary, that we're living contemporary lives in which the past is never in the past. But that doesn't mean that we are bound by some representation of it that appears supposedly authentic. And so I'm really glad that you've come back to this point here with this slide, for example, because there was in fact so much art that could have been included in that.
Mhm.
So many artists, so much art. And recently, I've begun to look at art even that has been produced on things like Jose, which is under visualized in our landscape. And Jose is probably one of the most visually stunning forms of public art contributed by Muslims since the 1860s. I think 1868 may have been the first commemoration of Jose in Trinidad, for example. And so if you think about that as art, if you think about that as art moving through the landscape, if you think about it as public art, and as art that was living, because artisans are constantly changing their design and their practice and their aesthetic, constantly inventing, and that has been going on since then, and yet doesn't figure it all, then you understand how much has been left out of our understanding of the Caribbean and its visual archive. And so I'm glad to see you go back as well in your reading of all of this, and to say that there are decades and decades to go back to.
There's so many people there should, in addition to Wendy Nanincher, there should be a Bernadette Prasad show. They
Yeah,
were not, they were people who were prolific
yeah,
and who produced really compelling, meaningful work in all senses,
yeah.
aesthetically, politically,
And
you
their
know,
work has not really been collected anywhere to be able to say, what's the
yeah,
conversation that was
yeah,
happening. I know
yeah.
that Professor Mohammed and Richard Charan, who's a writer, are working on the works of Isaiah Budu. Uh,
Mhm.
and
And
so,
of course, Patricia's work in this field, especially
yeah,
through her book, Imaging the Caribbean, has been so foundational.
yes, to us all. I mean, that's one of the reasons it's in her legacy that we are having this conversation today. It's a
Yes.
legacy I hope we can continue and that others will continue. Um, and as you mentioned, Bernadette Prasad also in Guyana, whose work has been pathbreaking, um, and not and across so many different ways that she's been thinking about herself, Guyana, the politics, the landscape, the shifts and the
Mhm.
changes.
Mhm.
So it
And
was,
so much of this work is just not collected, is left to be discarded or, you know. when they should be in museums. My wish is that there's some very wealthy person that sets up a better museum in
This is
many
it.
of these places.
This is
But
it.
that is part of the challenge in visual art. It is a kind of practice that does really need a lot of financial support behind it for things around, who can collect, what museums can purchase. It's so wrapped up in the economy of the market.
Yeah, and the need for spaces for contemporary art as well
Yeah.
in our Anglophone region. Um, I want us to just open up our conversation because I think it would be great to give others a chance to engage with you, not just questions, but also contributions. So, and then we're going to come back to you just to wrap, Andil, in case there's anything you wanted to close with. So I want to just open up to our audience here today. Thank you for being here and see if there's anybody who wants to jump in. As we wait to see if anybody wants to jump in, and they're welcome to, I'm just going to read some of the comments in the chat. So that'll maybe provide some responses and questions for you to answer. So Vidya, hi Vidya. Vidya is here from Guyana and is asking about the project that you were talking about and is saying that there's in Guyana, some conversations are happening around post-Puja debris. And so he was just following up on that.
Oh, I mean, it's Project Prithvi, if I think I remember correctly, and they have a really wonderful explanation. I thought I saw Aminta on the list just now.
Aminta is here.
Aminta, you're more. Oh, and Vidya wants to ask. I mean, Aminta would
Yeah,
probably
Vidya,
be.
would you like to
Yeah.
jump in, please?
Hi, sorry. So just to say thank you, thank you very much. And also thank you for invoking Bernadette because I looked and then I want to challenge you a little bit as you do this vision after indenture. I would really like you to engage with Guyana and Suriname, like Guyana. Come to Guyana. Come see the people in Guyana who
Listen,
live in.
Bernadette has been saying that to me for
You know,
2 years.
because
3 years.
I'm sorry, I have a big block, a big green heart chip on my shoulder every time we hear indenture, and praises to all you wonderful people who do it. It's very Trinidad centered and very not, Ghana is here. And there are reasons, we know there are reasons, and this is a conversation in Ghana because we have the same things going on in Ghana where we're not talking about these things, but there are young people, gatekeeping. There's a whole set of things happening. So I'm really grateful, Gabby, that you named Bernadette, in this because her work based in Guyana, like Wendy Nanan and so, and like they're home, they're in the country, known, whoever buys locally, then left the country, they're here still. So thanks so much for doing that. But I just hope intentionally as you conceptualize that 2026 event, that you find ways of outreach. I don't know how that would be, to really get to Suriname, Guyana, all the other places where indenture happened, because I think the experience is going to be richer. And I think some of the things you're going to see, we have a disabled artist of Indian origins from rural Ghana who we just heard about last year. He's just so amazing. And, and yeah, and just saying that because the oil and gas isn't really filtering down to the arts here in Ghana in the same way as it might have done in other places. So there are a lot of other challenges. So just challenging you with that and looking forward, that 2026 exhibition, which I hope will be the event, which I hope will be absolutely marvelous. I'm sure it will be. But thanks so much.
Thanks so much for that, Vidya. I just want to reassure you that Bernadette and I have been speaking for must be 3 years now, very regularly. I have actually been working on, well, one museum acquired her work in DC. The Art Museum of Americas has acquired 2 of her paintings. And I can't share the project yet because not everything is sealed, but there should be, I'm also working on getting her work in particular into the collection of another very big museum that hopefully, but the thing is, there's room for so many other people doing this work as well. Like I feel absolutely no proprietary ownership of, like I welcome other people working on Bernadette. In Suriname, one of my favorite contemporary artists is Diraj Ramasuj, someone who has done just brilliant work over, I think, the last 20 years now. And you're absolutely right. Like there's just so much work to be done. And someone who has less anxiety about flying than me needs also to be doing it.
And Vidya, just to say that our PhD student here at the IGDS, so now a third generation, which is Renuka Ananjit, has been is including Bernadette's work in her PhD thesis and has been doing field work.
I'm glad to hear that. I mean, I know Renuka was doing the political work, so I'm glad she included Bern. I'm glad to hear that. Yeah. Wonderful.
So,
right.
And Andil has brought up Bernadette in our previous conversations as well. But one thing I love about you, Vidya, is you're always challenging no matter what. And
I guess, as I said, we sit here and we hear, you know how, as I said, like I'm looking through journals and books. So Gabby and I have had this conversation. And again, this is not this is just from my end. I know, we've had this with the Commonwealth, people doing things and so on, that Guyana isn't there, and I mean, they're Guyanese origin scholars, and so who for various reasons probably don't have access to the same, their work might be in different places, and that's okay too. But it's just saying that, and I guess it's for us in Guyana here too to do a little bit more work now that we know about these, to not have to have Andil necessarily have to fly a plane and come, but we could find ways of doing it, and to think about it. So yeah, a challenge for all of us, but a wonderful opportunity. Thanks so much. I mean, yeah.
As I was saying, Vidya, I mean, I'd like this to be a conversation that happens with people who are thinking about indenture and its afterlife. So if there are artists who you think you want to put us here at the IGDS in touch with to be part of that kind of conversation, you put them in touch with me as well. So thank you.
I had also wanted to mention that there are so many exciting artists. It's been so great to work with Kelly Sinapa-Marie over the last how many years, and to witness the way that the investment in her work and the appreciation of it has dramatically grown over that time. And I can see on the horizon many other artists. There's the Felicia Karanach, there is Vanessa Godin, there are so many, and there are people I'm sure I don't know, because a lot similar to folks who were just not seen or not, I'm sure there are other folks who are working now in this area.
Well, Andil, you're going to be getting a lot of names between now and 2026.
That's great. The more, the better.
Yeah.
And the more too, for people who are wanting, I was so excited to meet what is, I think, the first time I've met an Indo-Caribbean PhD art history student in a program, who's doing some of this work. Like there's so much more room for people to take up this as part of their work. One of the challenges, I have to say, in dealing with the situation where institutions know very little of this history. So in return, in dealing with them, you don't actually have to know that much to sort of like provide them with some directions. One of the downsides of that is that they then often take up things that do not fairly or fully represent the fullness of the field, because they don't know much about it anyway. Like there's always have to explain who who you are, what this is, why are these, constantly, what do you mean they're Indians in Trinidad or Guyana? These very basic questions about the sheer existence of this community is so underknown that when you get to art, it really requires people who have a strong knowledge, be the ones who are situated as the folks to deal with institutions. So there's just an encouragement for people who are like students who might be interested in pursuing this work. There's so much available to be done.
Thanks for that, Andil. Dr. Lisa Autar, I see you are here. Nice to have you. Jump in.
Hi, everybody. So lovely to be a part of this conversation and to listen in. Andil, I want to thank you so much for doing this work, which has especially the collaborative element where you have provided a wonderful model for decentering ego and really making space for so many different voices and types of work. I feel like from the minute I met you, you've always been involved in collaborative types of scholarship, but also artistic production and the types of spaces that you've made, not just for artists to collaborate with you, but for us as recipients of these shows and these, spaces of reflection on our collective history have been really important for us as a community. I wanted to ask, and also just to say how important that is also to give us spaces to reflect on our contemporary experience. And I remember especially experiencing our holy waters at the Queen's Museum many years ago, and thinking about how fresh and wonderful it felt to have not just the Ganges centered, right, but the Seine and the other rivers that our contemporary experiences have crossed. So thank you for that, for the ways in which you're bringing our lived experiences now into conversations with with our histories that we're still trying to figure out what our relationships to them should be. I wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit about the work that you're doing to trouble this divide between the human and the other than human, right? And the natural world, and how you've perhaps experienced the reception of that kind of work, given our still being, I would say, fairly curtailed by respectability politics and about, this kind of inspired and shaped by colonialism's imperatives to have us demonstrate our modernity and our, our ability to be considered worthy and civilized, quote unquote. So could you maybe talk a little bit more about how you see embracing our wildness, embracing these relationships with the natural world allows us to move forward as Indo-Caribbean thinkers and beings?
Thanks so much for that question. It's so nice to see. It also makes me sad that we're all so far apart that the occasions we're so few to see each other in person. Thanks for that question. So for folks who might not know, in 2021, my book Nature's Wild proposed a refusal of a divide between human and non-human animal, in the context of recognizing that for centuries, animalization of Africans, indigenous people, other people, has been a central part of the colonial project to place others as less than human. So it is not surprising the aversion by colonized peoples or people who are from this lineage would be strongly opposed to being regarded as animals. So Lisa, when I was sort of doing book talks, I was always curious that whenever it was with a Caribbean interlocutor, there was always a great deal of anxiety about talking about the animal part. Sometimes it was just unwillingness. So I would have conversations in animal studies that were very much engaging about that, because that's the core of what they're doing. And there are a lot of points of connection. But in Caribbean studies, often it was like, what are you talking about? Why? How can you say I'm an animal? That is an injury. And historically, it has been an injury. But, the proposal is that it is an injury. Refusing the injury is a refusal of respectability politics. And so that's why I link it to struggles for sexual rights and some of the cases, like those in Guyana, where cross-dressing people were arrested for being, not respectable, for being animals. So for me, I think that over these now 3 years that having been engaged in some of those conversations, I feel more confident about making them, because I think the reception to it is warmer as more dialogue happens. So if in the first conversations they were like, I don't know about this animal thing, like probably one of the Caribbean scholars I respect the most, that's one of the first things she said in our conversation, is like, I don't know about this animal thing, Andil. And it speaks to how deeply ingrained we are in a politics of respectability, and it so disempowers us. It is mired in racism and classism, especially, and it really stops us from appreciating the fullness of the cultural forms we produce, the intelligence, it does so much. And then as an environmentalist, for me, it's so fundamental that we raise this question now, when our survival is intractable from the survival of others. And so it becomes not just important to pursue this line, and it's something I continue to do in the work I just shared, the Ixora sculpture. In preparing for that lecture, part of the reasoning, the argument I make in proposing that as a kind of public monument, is our ability to see ourselves represented in a non-human form, so that it is not a denial of our worth to be associated with non-human forms. What it does is disempowers the injury of calling oneself a look you animal, And I have to say, this is hardly new. I mean, Caribbean people of all kinds have resisted that kind of onus put upon themselves to prove themselves human, not animal. Like, you see it all the time in Trinidad. There's so many examples. Like, I don't think I've ever been to Trinidad and not seen an example of someone exercising accusation of animality as a kind of respectability politics, and the person stooping as a response and as a denial of their violence. So you see that all the time. I think in academia, we're still beginning to grapple with that though we have had this long conversation, I think, about an awareness of respectability politics, when it comes to some of the specific facets of it, like animalization, like how many of us have been in a classroom when the teacher says, stop behaving like animals, or don't dress like an animal. That happens so often. It's so part of the socialization that makes us believe in this very racist and classist framework. But at the same time, as creative as we are constantly also undermining it. And I think we can have more forms of that appreciation. I mean, one of the things that I mentioned in the book is, like, I think about the very different way in which, say, Christopher Cozier develops his relationship to respectability politics in Port of Spain than I do in George Village, where it's almost absent as a kind of force, where it is overwhelming in Christopher Cozier's youth about trying to produce yourself as a good citizen. There's something to appreciate about the distance from the center that allows people to navigate out, to be outside this eye of discipline. That if in Port of Spain, these are the future sons and daughters of the nation, we have to make sure they're respectable, good citizens. There's something marvelous about being outside of power and not having that same onus. And I think, it's what try to begin to unpack, and I think more and more people are doing it. But I do think there's no other way to go. I've written some of my work on chickens. My next essay that will come out in November is looking at the history of chickens and the way in which our relationships to chickens might also turn us toward this recognition of ourselves as animal. And I'm, hoping to do that also with the Ixora flower, this weed like strong, it grows everywhere. It's taken over so much of the Caribbean. It has so many qualities that are just, treated as banal, unassuming, unimportant, but has been this kind of robust flower. And to see ourselves in something as banal as that, and not necessarily, perhaps the most beautiful iconography, that we don't need, that there's something about placing ourselves in the same status with other forms of life that can be deeply empowering in this context.
Thanks for that, Andil. Thanks, Lisa, for that very profound opening. We have Professor Joy Mahabir here as well. And as we are moving towards wrapping, we want to make sure to hear anybody who wants to kind of jump in. Professor Mahabir.
Okay, thanks, Gabby. Are you hearing me?
We are.
Okay, all right. I wasn't finding the raise hand icon at the bottom of the screen. So sorry, I had to well, thank you, Andil and Gabby. Gabby, thank you for initiating these conversations. I think they're so important. And I wasn't going to ask about nature as well, but I just wanted to say that once you see animal as an essentialist term, like human, you can, it just opens up so many trajectories and ways of thinking, new ways of thinking. But I wanted to ask, and thank you to Vidya for bringing up Bernadette Passad. A few years ago, I visited her in Guyana, and she has most of her paintings in her studio, and it was such a wonderful experience just to see her paintings with her. That was just a personal remembrance. Andil, I wanted to ask you about the what you said about public monuments. Now, did you mean that they are state monuments commemorating Indenture, or I wasn't sure if this was individual artists or commissioned? Okay.
So I mean, it's unfortunately not on Zoom, but it will hopefully be shared in some other outlet with a broader community. But I've been so I have made 4 propositions for public monuments that are not exactly monuments to indentureship, but are about questioning the way we think of memorialization as a whole. But as part of this research, I looked at public monuments to indentureship. Public does not usually mean state-supported. Some are. There are many, many monuments. I really have to say that Kumar Mahabir's series, he did two were the Sunday video series that he does every Sunday. 2 sessions were on public sculpture, so those were really important. They identified some of the key people who were involved. Many of these sculptures are the initiative of a single person wanting to do them, and often without much artistic input from artists. Sometimes many of these have been supported by the Indian government. And as I mentioned before, which is an indictment on both sides, that this is often where, people turn to because they feel like locally underseen or insignificant. So, following 2020, there's so much of the Black Lives Matter movement and Idle No More, the Indigenous movement. They were really sort of focused our attention on what public statues and monuments mean. You all probably remember scenes of statues being tossed or pulled down and removed in the United States, but also the Caribbean. And so it's an important moment, I think, to think about what do we want from a monument? And as part of that, I looked at those monuments across Mauritius has several, Guadeloupe has 5. Guyana has several. And it's really interesting, the continuities between them and some of the limitations. And a lot of it is economics. A lot of it is that they are not supported by state funds. And what, as a consequence, it means a single person who is well endowed financially might dictate what a monument becomes and where it is and what it's supposed to represent. And sometimes, and that does not necessarily diminish all meaning from it, but they are important things to lay on the table and to think about. So yes, there are many. Even in, I hadn't even seen the ones in Trinidad, but there are at least 2, 3. Yeah. So, and like the Chaguanas one and the one at Temple of the Sea, they're just plaques, and that is partly a consequence of expense. Like my little Ixora bronze sculpture was, in making this, I had to be cognizant of money, but even that was, several $1,000s to make. And that is just a model for a monument. So these are expensive projects. And this in general is not a moneyed community that supports in that way. This is not a large community. This is in terms of the whole world, these are relatively small communities with limited financial power. And in most cases, it's the Indian government that intervenes to quickly support a project. Just before, I know we're going to wrap up, I would like to say, I hope you have a session on Joy's work on jewelry at some point as part of the series.
I'm constantly reading.
Because that's critical to have.
Going back to it all the time. And also, I was just telling you that I'm reading her novel, Juve, at the moment as well. And the story of Black marriage. And so it is great to have everyone in the room. Thank you so much, Joy, for coming in. As we wrap, just to get back to some of the comments in the chat so you can answer them, Andil. We got videos asking about the post-puja cleanup. Christine Samwaru, who is from the Breadfruit Collective and who has been doing a lot of environmental work, says the intersections to environmentalism can be easily connected here. So, so read her comments in the chat, and I think that's really useful. And I know that as you concluded your book, you also talked about this time of ecological crisis and why it's really necessary to have that kind of that sense of connection with the ecology around us. Aminta has made some comments in the chat that you can check out also. But Rachel Barrett has asked, is there a digital version of the catalog from Everything Slackens in a Wreck? Or perhaps you could say a public collection that has a copy, or maybe a library that has a copy, as she'd like to read the essays. So maybe, I don't know if you want to respond to that. And before
there's some, oh, sorry.
No, one more, just so that you can look at the 2 and then come in. Claire Ania Virgil from Martinique, who's a photographer and on Instagram, so you can check out her work, has asked, is there space for photography in the curatorial work that you're doing? So I think if you could answer those 2, then, which are the kind of 2 questions, then maybe we could wrap.
Sure. Oh, people are still entering the room. Thank you. First, I just want to thank you so much for leading this conversation and for the invitation to be here. And this initiative is so important. So I look forward to all of the other sessions. In terms of my training is primarily as an environmentalist. All of my degrees are in environmental studies. So even when I am not explicitly talking about them, they are always the underbelly of everything, that interest. So the Christine's comment is not surprising, because it really is sort of the basis of everything after. But often not stated explicitly. And of course, there's room for photography in this work. It would be really interesting because so much of our imagination is linked to those colonial photographs. When probably anyone in this room, if I said, imagine a photograph linked to indentureship in the Indo-Caribbean, those are the first things that emerge. So I think there's lots of room for that kind of practice to grow and be highlighted. In my own exhibition, there is some photography, although stage photography as part of the exhibition. And I'll announce the more details of that in November. But I really hope that people can share it. The last thing I'll mention, because people ask about publication, is that what I try to do, and you're reminding me that perhaps I haven't done this with Everything Slackens, because there are only limited numbers of copies that make it to print, although 3,000 copies was a pretty good run for our catalog. Like most catalogs are like 250 copies. So it speaks volumes about how important that show was that all of those copies are gone. But I will post the PDFs at my website. So it's just my name.com. If you go there and click on publications or exhibitions, it's really important to me that things are shared freely. So as much as I am able to, I will have things there that people can download. There should be copies in Trinidad. I had brought a bunch of copies to circulate in libraries and so on. There should be copies there somewhere. Thank you so much, everyone.
Everyone, it is 1:30, and so we have to wrap. I want to thank Professor Andil Gosine for this session. Part of my goal was in doing the work that I'm doing to learn, to get a chance to learn from the others who have been doing a lot of this work before me, and in ways that I'm learning from. And so it was a privilege to be able to get Andil for this hour and a half to be able to hear you reflect on your work and share like this for us all, really to learn and reflect ourselves. And also, as I said, if there's one other artist or thinkers or writers that you think we should have in these kinds of conversations, please do reach out to me at my email and let me know, and I hope who you think should be on our radar, and I hope we can include them. And I think Andil was a really important start to this particular thread in the conversation, because he had been doing this work of thinking about art after indenture in such a pioneering way for such a long time. And to have somebody from our generation who is so pioneering is a real gift. So we're privileged to have you start this this whole thread that I hope continues with younger artists, artists from the Caribbean, artists in the diaspora, artists in transoceanic connections as well. And of course, I would like to thank the team at the IGDS, Miss Lesady Legal and Miss Catherine Chan, who have been supporting this today. And thank you all for being here, for jumping in. Please like the Facebook page of the IGDS so you can get updates about events, and also our Instagram, because that'll let you know when we're having other things. And please just continue to work to create the work that I'm sure so many of you are doing in your own lives, as well as supporting the work of others. I think that's what's ultimately going to bring us all a lot of joy. I wish you all well from a rainy Trinidad and Tobago, and thank you all.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Andil.
Thank you. Thank you all for this wonderful engagement.